It's now my pleasure to introduce Father James Earps, who will lead us in prayer and actually introduce the singers. Father Earps is the Director of Campus Ministry here at Boston College, and it's my pleasure to make this introduction. Father Earps.
As we begin this second year of the Church in the 21st Century project, we ask the blessing and the presence of God's Holy Spirit. May the Spirit, who is the source of all true renewal, remind us of all that we have learned and be with us as we map out the road ahead. Please join Meyer Chambers and the Liturgy Arts Group of Boston College in singing the simple refrain from the Ecumenical Monastery of Taizé in France, Veni Sancte Spiritus, Come, Holy Spirit.
Believers was of one heart and one mind. For all who are baptized into Christ have clothed themselves with Christ.
Pray from the documents of Vatican II. It is therefore quite clear that all Christians in any walk of life are called to the fullness of Christian life and to the perfection of love. And by this holiness, a more humane manner of life is fostered in our society.
Den Glanz deiner Herrlichkeit vom Himmel strahlen, Veni Sancte Spiritus.
We pray from Saint Therese of Lisieux. If the Church is a body composed of different members, it could not lack the noblest of all. It must have a heart burning with love. If the heart ceased to function, the apostles would forget to preach the gospel and the martyrs will refuse to shed their blood.
Espíritu Santo, ven, ven, Padre de los pobres, ven, ven, luz de los corazones, ven y Santo Espíritu.
We pray from St. Ignatius of Loyola. Love shows itself in deeds more than in a multiplicity of words.
Santo Espíritu, riempi i cuori dei tuoi fedeli, e accendi in essi il fuoco del tuo amore. Veni, Santo Espíritu.
Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful ones. Enkindle in us the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, that we may be recreated, and you shall renew the face of the earth. Amen.
Thank you very much. It has been exactly 1 year since we first launched the series called The Church in the 21st Century, 1 year ago tonight. And I'd like to thank all of those who have been involved over the past year in creating a dialogue that has provided hope in a backdrop of extraordinary revelation and change. Like many of you, I studied the Baltimore Catechism in a Sunday school not far from here, Holy Name Church in West Roxbury. In it, the definition of the church is very, very simple. It says, the church is the congregation of all those who profess the faith of Christ, partake of the same sacraments, and are governed by their lawful pastors under one visible head. In short, the church is the people, the congregation of all those who profess the faith, you and me. It is not a building, it is not assets, it is not land, it is us. We have the opportunity, thanks to the leadership of Boston College, to get involved in a dialogue about the future of our faith. Much has changed for the better since we last gathered. Only the most optimistic among us could have envisioned a more productive, honest, open, and hopeful first 100 days for our new bishop, Sean Patrick O'Malley. Some of the changes that have taken place, regrettably, have been quite necessary. We have a new leader in the church here in Boston, and I must say, while his burdens and responsibilities are many, he appears to be up to the task. He appears to be a very holy man, a very good, bright, decisive man, a timely combination. At the same time, there is much work to be done. I observed last year that our church is 2,000 years old, and like anything that has been closed up for a long time, it has gotten a little stuffy. Over the past year, a window has been cracked, but by no means have the doors been swung wide open. The new bishop needs our help. He needs your help. We are getting very good around here at closing parishes, closing schools, and cutting back on what has come to be called social services, but what we have long considered the corporal works of mercy. Our great faith was not built by closing buildings or closing minds. We need to help, and those of us who have been critical also need to put a shoulder to the wheel. We need to help Bishop O'Malley and others with the many important missions wherever they may take us. That service will require our most valuable asset, our time, and it may also require our money. It is now my pleasure to introduce Father William Leahy of the Society of Jesus. Father Leahy has just begun his 8th year as president of Boston College. It was his idea to create the series we know as the Church in the 21st Century. And many of you may remember his comments this day 1 year ago. Father Leahy is one of the good priests, one of the many good priests, one of the majority of good priests, and his notion that was that we needed to come together and talk and pray and think about what had happened and what we might do to make things better together. I applaud that. It is my pleasure to introduce the 25th president of Boston College, Father William P. Leahy.
Thank you. First, let me thank you for being here tonight for this event, which formally opens the second year of our Church in the 21st Century initiative. We began this effort to help the Catholic community in America deal with the sexual abuse crisis and to explore major issues facing Catholics in the United States. Through June 2003, this initiative has offered 75 programs, attracted more than 13,000 people to campus, and reached out through its website and various publications to thousands more. We have been able to do so because of the tremendous interest, creativity, and flexibility of numerous faculty and staff at Boston College. After more than a year of listening, programs, and activities, we have learned a great deal about the state of the Catholic Church in the United States. It is evident that the problem of sexual abuse by priests and bishops and its toleration at the highest levels have brought into public view issues that have been simmering below the surface for many years. Among them are the gap between Catholic teaching on sexuality and the practice of many Catholics, discontent among many priests and lay people, especially women, about their roles in the Church, and deep concern about how the faith is being handed on to the next generations. We also learned that while people's faith has remained strong, their confidence in the organization and episcopal leadership of the Church has been weakened by the crisis. That many individuals desire to help the Church in this time of need, but they want to be asked and to be assured that their commitment and expertise will be incorporated into the structures and decision-making processes in ways that are more than symbolic. We've learned that the crisis has increased the tendency of many, especially the younger generation, to make a distinction between their faith in Christ and their commitment to the institutional church. We've learned that our church lacks structures for effective communication and dialogue among bishops, priests, and laymen and women, structures which could have helped address the crisis in its early stages and which are essential for the renewal we seek and must have. We've learned, too, that the faith and commitment to social justice
among young adult Catholics remain strong, while simultaneously their knowledge of the basic teachings of Catholicism and their commitment to the Church as an institution are far weaker than among previous generations of Catholics. Another piece that we have learned is that many Catholics operate from an inadequate understanding of the Church's history and development during the past 2,000 years. While the fundamentals of our faith have not changed, the Church over the centuries has adapted its structures and approaches in response to new circumstances. We learn, too, that the tremendous moral and social force that the Catholic Church represents in American society, not only to the 65 million U.S. Catholics, but to society in general, has been damaged, resulting in the muting of the Church's voice on moral, ethical, and social questions, and reduced financial support for the good work done in Catholic parishes, schools, hospitals, and social service agencies. Another thing we've learned is that there are strong disagreements about the causes and resolution of the current crisis. Some insist that the cause is a failure of leadership and misuse of power in an increasingly dysfunctional organization out of touch with its members. Others maintain that the problem stems from a culture of dissent from official church teachings. Those who blame the leadership and cite structural problems hold that the solution lies in reform of the organization with more transparency, greater accountability, more attention to equality of the baptized, whether bishops, priests, or laity. On the other hand, those who trace our current difficulties to dissent urge adherence to official church teaching on faith and morals, as well as increased stress on personal holiness. We learned from listening to representatives of both of these positions that neither is completely correct, but that each contains an important element of truth and should be considered. The crisis, painful as it has been and continues to be, provides an opportunity to stop and examine our church, to bring into the light and clearer focus the important issues that face the church at the beginning of this century, issues that must be addressed if the church in the United States is to once again flourish. Tonight, we have assembled a distinguished moderator and insightful panelists to comment from their perspectives what the church has learned from the crisis and where we must go if we are to achieve the renewal we all want. I hope you will find tonight's discussion informative and worthwhile, and I'm very grateful that so many of you were able to come here tonight. Thank you.
Just one note. I wonder if we could just ask those few of you who may still have your cell phones on if you just turn them off before we turn this program over to our panel. Like so many of us in America, I've enjoyed watching Meet the Press with Tim Russett, and I believe Mr. Russett has become the gold standard. He loves politics, he loves journalism, and he loves where the two intersect. He is considered the best. He is tough but fair, and he has the uncanny ability to get a straight answer out of people who are not used to giving a straight answer to difficult questions. Tim Russett's passion for politics and journalism are only exceeded by his passion for life and family. His judgment is impressive, with perhaps one exception. He actually believes the Buffalo Bills are destined to win the Super Bowl this year. He actually believes that Drew Bledsoe and Lawyer Malloy were just in training here in preparation for a successful career in Buffalo. One of the things we recognize as a great Jesuit university is that no one is perfect. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to introduce our very distinguished panel leader, Tim Russett. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It is indeed an honor to be here. I have not been in such an august Catholic setting since I had a private audience with the Holy Father in a room about this size, empty but for myself. I was there to convince him it was in his interest to appear on the NBC Today program. As the door opened in the back of the room, the Vicar of Christ was there, dressed in white. I approached him, and suddenly my mind quickly turned from the prospect of NBC's ratings and Brian Gumbel's career to the prospect of salvation. And you heard this tough, no-nonsense moderator of Meet the Press begin our conversation by saying, "Bless me, Father." The Pope said, "You are the man called Timothy from NBC." I said, "I'm your guy, don't forget that." He said, "They tell me you're a very important man of the network." I said, "Your Holiness, with all due deep respect, there's only two of us in this room. I'm a most distant second." He looked at me, smiled, put his hands on my shoulders, and said, "Right." That's humility. We have a great panel tonight, and we're going to have some fun. It's a very serious subject. We're going to have some fun. We're going to talk about common ground and how this wonderful church of ours can come together and discuss issues seriously with respect and with civility. The first thing, if you'd like to take your jackets off, please feel comfortable. It's warm in here. The moderator's getting ready now, I can tell you. In your program, you can read about our panelists. I'll just give you a very brief description. On my very far left, Cantalita Montes. She's the principal of the Thomas Gardner Elementary School. Next to her, Peter Steinfels, the former religion correspondent for the New York Times, who has a terrific new book out, A People Adrift, The Crisis in the Roman Catholic Church in America, a must-read if you care about this subject. We have Elizabeth Paulus, who's in the class of Arts and Sciences, class of 2004. My far right, Patrick Downs, the Lynn School of Education, class of 2005. Sister Mary Johnson, Associate Professor at Emmanuel College. And Boston's own Brian Hare, the President of Catholic Charities. People from different perspectives, please welcome them. Peter Steinfels, let me start with you. You have written brilliantly about this subject, and we ask you to share some of those insights tonight. What must our church do to restore credibility and trust in its leadership?
That's a subject many, many pages long. Let me just point to one thing. I'm going to take a word that I'm stealing from a rival book written by David Gibson called The Coming Catholic Church, and he uses the word doctrinizing. And I think it's a good word to characterize the tendency we have fallen into to raise every every practical and pastoral issue to that of high doctrine. And I think my first suggestion would be at every level of the church, from the parish to the episcopacy, that without trying to minimize the importance of theology and doctrinal issues, we emphasize the pastoral questions, the practical questions, and whenever possible, the empirical questions, whether we're talking about parish life, Sunday worship, religious education, or issues of sexuality and family.
Sister, would you like to take comments on that?
I think that one of the things we should do is bring the two tensions that Father Leahy described together and seek common ground. And I think particularly for the younger generations in the church, we have to lift up the notion of personal holiness and effective structures for mission. And those two tensions in the church have been, I think, taken apart and teased apart over the last 20 or 25 years or so, and this confronted me about a month ago when I gave a talk in another part of the country, and a young man came up to me, and he said after the talk, "I want to figure out what you are." And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "You began the talk by mentioning Catholic social teaching." So right away I said, "She's a liberal." And then you talked about personal morality, and I changed and I said, "She's a conservative." Then you mentioned Dorothy Day, and I said, "She must be a radical." "So what are you?" And I said, "I'm a Catholic." And he said, "But what kind?" He said, "I've never just used the word Catholic without a word in front of it." And that young man really made me go home and think about a new generation that's only heard about liberal Catholics and conservative Catholics. And we've got to talk about who and what are Catholics.
In this search for common ground, Father Hare, you work on Capitol Hill with Republicans who agree with church position on issues, Democrats who agree with Catholic positions on issues. Very few of the senators agree with all the positions of the church. And the divide seems to grow where Democratic Catholic politicians who are enormously supportive of Catholic charities but disagree on the position of abortion are disinvited from certain events. On the other hand, the same Democrats don't like faith-based education issues. How do you find this common ground that Sister's talking about as the church's representative on Catholic charities to Congress, and how do you explain these divergent views to Catholic leadership?
Well, I think the first thing I'd say is that you're right. We have no stable allies among the principal political parties in the country. The second thing I'd say is I think that's a good position for a church to be in. I don't think a church ought to be any political party's mascot. So I would rather deal with the divide that you absolutely accurately point out than to be a kept priest by some party. That is not a very good idea. Now, having said that, I would then say that the way you try and deal with folks on the Hill is that you try to be two things, I think. You try to be honest and accurate. You go in and you've got to be able to make your case, the moral case as well as the empirical case, and you don't go in and make believe that there's no disagreement with the member when you know in fact there is. That you find the point of agreement and you acknowledge the disagreement. When I talk to leaders in the church, I think the important thing is to stress, I think, that this problem cannot be solved by coercion. It cannot be solved by coercing public officials into line. You have to find a way in which you can live with degrees of disagreement, in which they're going to have to put up with you advocating a range of issues that they do not fully support, and you're going to have to put up with the fact that they got elected and not appointed by the hierarchy. And therefore, the hierarchy has to deal with them as adult Catholics with complicated views and try and find as much common ground with each side as you can.
Elizabeth, as a young Catholic, what do you think the church must do to restore credibility and trust in leadership? What would you say if you met with the Catholic bishops and cardinals of the United States?
Okay. I think that the Archdiocese of Boston handled this situation fairly well over the summer by the appointing of the new Archbishop. I think that what young people are looking for are people who have a much more pastoral role. I think they want to see people who have been active in the past that don't just want to be in the position because it's a power trip, that they're truly there to serve the people. I think that the church also needs to reach out and needs to pull the laity back in, that it needs to feel like we all have a say in this, that it's not just the Archbishop's church, but that it's my church as well, and it's all of your church. And I think only when that happens will people trust in the Catholic Church enough to go forward.
Catalina, we've had two conversations. The most recent was tonight when you were talking about being in Cuba and dealing with hurricanes, and how it was particularly timely tonight as we talk about this, but it was a fond memory because the families came together, the children came together, and weathered it as one. Our earlier conversation was about the Hispanic community in the United States and finding themselves more drawn to evangelical churches than the Catholic Church in many ways. What must the Catholic leadership do to reach out to the Hispanic community? And what do you say to them about their trust and credibility?
Well, I would say that I feel that the first thing that the Hispanics have to feel is that they have to feel accepted. Once they feel accepted, I think that the leadership and the Catholic people have to be warm and have to try to get them to feel that they have a support. They have someone that cares for them. Hispanics, the Hispanic population, we are all immigrants. We have no relative in here. We come to this country all by ourselves. And I think what the evangelicals are doing is that they are giving them that moral support, that caring, that love that everybody needs to receive. And I think that the Catholics have to be more welcoming, more warm. I think that they have to be reaching out to them and say, we're here, we are with you, and we support you. Because that kind of care and warmth is what will attract the Hispanics to the church. Although I also have to say that the Hispanic church is a little different from the American church in the sense that the Hispanic has a great belief in a Blessed Mary and different saints. And that's something that somehow I think it's a little bit of cultural shock for us that is not such a big devoted faith, to Our Lady like we have and to our saints. So there are cultural issues, but there is also the issue of being alone and being accepted.
Patrick, we talked earlier, and you mentioned, echoing what Peter Steinfeld said, about issues of sexuality. And you've told people that you would perhaps feel a potential vocation, but also feel drawing to the notion of parenthood and being a spouse. Talk about the church and its teachings on sexuality as you see them, and what you would tell the hierarchy about bridging the gap, as Father Leahy said, between what is preached and what is practiced.
Well, that's a huge question in terms of addressing sexuality.
But you're a student at Boston College.
Well, I think as everyone has said so far, that we need to address everyone in the church. We need to address the people who do feel as though sexuality is a big part of the church and is a big part of their lives. The most important way to do that and best way to do that is to go directly to people and ask them their views on it. In terms of homosexuality, I think many people who are homosexual feel as though they are too immigrants to the church, and that they don't feel as though they have a home. And that I've known many people who have been very Catholic, but they're not sure where they fit into the whole large scheme of things. And I know that is extremely frightening for them, as is it for anyone who might be left out of a group.
I want to pick up what Peter and Sister raised in terms of the church, the focus on doctrinal issues, the difference between liberal, conservative Catholics. During the entire debate over the last year on the crisis, I interviewed Father McCloskey from Washington, who made it very clear that in his mind that the future of the Catholic Church in the United States should be to reduce its ranks from 60 million to 30 million. And there would be real Catholics there, people who would practice the faith, adhere to the teachings of the Church, and my word, not his, that there's enough dealing with so-called cafeteria Catholics who pick and choose what they want to follow. Peter, how do you talk about that in the context of tonight in dealing with the trust and leadership of the hierarchy, but also the responsibility of the laity?
Well, I think it would be a terrible mistake to follow the policy that I guess is called the politique de pire. We'll look for the worst thing to happen in hopes that it will set us up for the best thing. I think in politics there's a long history of this not succeeding. I think it's a policy that would have the American church, which is and remains tremendously vibrant, pursue the course of the church in so many European countries where there's been extensive secularization. That was an answer to Father McCluskey's strategy, but I don't think I addressed the other point you had. What? Remind me of.
If, in fact, we are dealing with that issue of, as you said, an overemphasis, if you will, on some of the doctrinal issues, and Father McCluskey's view is there's nothing wrong with that, and that's healthy, and that's the future of the church, what would you say to the Catholic leadership in order to win the trust and confidence of laity that they should be open to a discussion that you're suggesting and an emphasis more on social action and justice than simply enforcement, if you will, of some of the doctrinal issues?
I think I wanted to actually go back. I realize the point you had made, you had brought up the phrase cafeteria Catholics. And it's a phrase that distresses me a great deal because the image of cafeteria is kind of picking and choosing as you go along on the basis of preferences. And I really think that that is a serious problem and something that I myself would reject. And if that's what Father McCluskey would oppose, I'd be with him. On the other hand, I do think that in the array of Catholic teachings and in our efforts to live out these teachings, we sometimes have to make choices, and people have made these choices seriously and conscientiously and prayerfully. And in those cases, I think it's very, very different from the notion and the imagery of cafeteria Catholic. And I think that it's that kind of response, that sort of serious grappling with the whole heritage of Catholic teaching in the context of prayer, in the context of the sacramental life, that the bishops, I think I would encourage them to encourage exactly that, and that's a form of living out our doctrinal heritage, which I think is realistic and is in line with what Brian said earlier about not attempting to coerce when you must persuade.
Sister, in our conversations, we talked about the state of the church, the fact that you've written that there are 19,000 parishes in our country, and that if current trends continue, there could be as many as 6,000 without a priest to administer sacraments. As you look at the demographics of our church, what do you say to the hierarchy, leadership of our church, about that issue, about that problem, and the potential solutions for it?
First thing I would say is that there are many social scientists who've studied the church for 20 and 30 years who have credible data, who care deeply about the church's mission and know that the mission rests upon effective structures, and that the bishops must sit down with scholars and get the data, hear what they have to say about their analysis of the data, and then make more informed judgments in light of those conversations. And I'll give you one example. When Bishop Gregory said the other day that he felt that a married priesthood would not produce more priests, there are some social scientists who've studied that question for about 20 years, and they would disagree with him. And what I would love to do is get all of them into one room and to have a real conversation about what the needs are in terms of the sacramental life of the church in the United States, what people's hopes are. We know all the data shows that people believe that God is very present in a special way to us in the Catholic community, and that is through the 7 public sacraments of the Church. But we know that currently 2,500 parishes don't have resident priests. If things progress as they are progressing with no intervention or no change, 6,000 parishes will have to close. Who will make the decisions about which parishes will be closed or merged or yoked? How much can the older generation of men in the priesthood be expected to do? Those are all questions that many thoughtful Catholics and many Catholic scholars care deeply about. And I would hope the day would come very soon when the bishops would sit down and be surrounded by the best in terms of the best data, the best analysis, and then go forward.
Father Hare, is the Church capable of stepping back and analyzing this problem and saying, who is going to administer the sacraments? What is our future in the United States? And what alternatives do we have in terms of the priesthood that we should be talking about thoughtfully and respectfully, and perhaps even presenting to the Vatican?
I think they're capable of it. As a matter of fact, I think the problem is being dealt with at two different levels. One level is forums like this, in academic settings where people lay out the options in explicit terms, provide the statistical data as Sister Mary indicates, and simply look at empirical trends and what their consequences are. Those discussions are broad, overarching. They tend not to have anything that isn't to be discussed. It's open, and it is an inquiry that is at home in a university. I think many bishops are hesitant to enter those kinds of discussions. They're hesitant to enter them partly because they don't control the data that the social scientists control, partly because they are divided among themselves about what to do, and the question of where they will stand vis-a-vis their peers influences them, and partly because they are directly accountable to Rome and they have different views of how you ought to deal with that. At the same time, if you get around the country the way my job requires that I do all over the country, they are trying to solve it practically. That is to say, there are in fact women who administer parishes around the country. They have various titles that they use. There are in the ministry of the Church a whole series of different team approaches meant to deal with this. Now, I do not think that pragmatic, ad hoc, on-the-ground approach is adequate. But I would want to say they're trying to deal with it at that level. I think what's necessary is that the in-principle theoretical framework pushes the questions out further, and the ad hoc will only take you so far. The question about having the bishops address it in its full range of possibilities is hindered by the three things I talked about. I think many feel unsure of themselves in this kind of setting, not because they're not intelligent, but this isn't the métier they deal with. Secondly, they worry about where they are among themselves, and they know they disagree. And then thirdly, there is the question of how they think about Rome. If you're asking me, do I think they can put together a coherent posture and take it to Rome, I would be hesitant to think that that will happen right away.
What can the laity do to motivate, encourage, cajole their leadership to become more engaged on this issue?
Well, when you asked Peter the question at the beginning, what do we have to do to regain credibility? My view is, as a kind of simple principle, is we've got to treat adults as adults in the church. That is to say, we now have in the Catholic Church in the United States the most educated laity the Catholic Church has ever confronted in 2,000 years of history. You can't have a situation where men and women in corporations, in universities, in politics are in charge of their life, are treated as adults, and not be treated as adults inside the church. So the question of then how to treat people as adults, how to mobilize that kind of discussion, I think partly comes from a laity that understands what a significant strategic role they are now in. 100 years ago tonight, this discussion would have been inconceivable in American Catholicism. Literally inconceivable. That you would have this kind of room at this kind of university on this kind of topic. That means that we're in a different place than the history of this church has been in, and the laity are in a strategic leverage position. I'm not calling for revolution. I don't think that works in the Catholic Church, and I don't think one ought to try it. I do think that there's a range of definable, discussable issues that adults need to be treated with as adults, and the laity need to say at the parish level and every other level, we simply won't accept anything except adult conversation, which is not rebellion and which is not an attempt to defy the church. It is simply an attempt for people to deal with their life coherently and consistently.
Sister, you had your hand up.
And while I feel the bishops should be learning their social science, I think the laity should as well. So also in that room, poring over the data, should be lay people. And one important study that Father Hare might be interested in reference to his point about priestless parishes, it's a book written a few years ago entitled They Call Her Pastor. And it was 80 interviews with women, single and married lay women and sisters who pastor parishes in the Midwest and the Southwest. And the sociologists who conducted the study found that in all of the parishes, without exception, when the woman took over, attendance increased, collections increased, the priests who worked with the women pastors were delighted because they felt they did not have the gift of administration and finance, so they were happy to concentrate on what they felt called to do, which was the sacramental ministry. And many of those women had wonderful bishops who had called them forth to the ministry of administering parishes.
Liz, women play a very prominent role at this university and throughout society. Talk about the role you would like to see for women in the Catholic Church.
Okay. First, I think it's very important to point out that although oftentimes it feels like women don't have a role in the Catholic Church, there's a statistic about 85% of non-ordained roles are held by women in the church. I think it's very important to keep that in mind, that although they might not be the priests, they might not be the ones who are making the final decision, they still are very actively involved. As a young woman, as a theology major, I certainly would like to see women become ordained. If you look at the reasons, which is a whole other conversation, I'm sure, there's really not a lot that can be said against women's ordination. The problem that you run into is that this is an area where conversation is basically closed with the Vatican. I mean, with Cardinal Ratzinger's letter on the ordination of women, it was an unequivocal, we're not discussing this. So I think that now women, although I think you need to keep going in that direction to try to promote that, I also think that women need to start pursuing more creative roles, you know, that perhaps, as Sister Mary said, that there are other ways that women can serve as pastors in the community without necessarily having to be priests. So it's, I don't know, there's a lot more that can be said, but I'll keep it brief.
I think there should be a real effort to open the question of ordaining women to the diaconate. There is centuries of experience where women were ordained to the diaconate, and surely the roles they played in those early centuries were not exactly parallel to the roles played by men ordained to the diaconate, but the historical studies show that the ordination rituals and so on were quite similar, suggesting something that a church as tradition-minded as ours could begin, and it would make women part of the orders of the church and therefore have a special role to the relationship to the bishop and a role in decision-making. And it seems to me that that still is a possibility.
Catalina.
I feel that women can make tremendous contribution to the Catholic Church, and I feel that women is very often overlooked and treated like a different class of citizen. I always think in a person that I read a lot about her, and I think it should be a great example in the Catholic Church, and it's St. Elizabeth Seton. St. Elizabeth Seton was a widow, young widow with 5 children, yet she has such a faith that she worked hard and founded a religious order and is the founder of the Catholic schools. If St. Elizabeth was able to do that, I think a lot of other women could accomplish a lot for the Catholic Church.
Patrick?
If someone is to feel the presence of God within themselves, whether that be a woman or a homosexual or a male, who is the church to limit their potential in growing in the church? Who are we to say that they can only attend Mass or be a Eucharistic minister? If the power of God is within them just as much as a male priest, how can we deny them to progress as people of God? That to me is the underlining message of it all, and that is the most powerful of it all as well.
Father Hare, as you know, there are many Catholic priests who converted from the Anglican faith who have wives, who are married. How do we understand that, accept that, when applied to the Roman Rite?
Well, of course, among the problems we're talking about tonight, the question about the celibacy of the clergy is an issue, but it is a simpler issue than some of the others. As Liz has pointed out, the discussion about the ordination of women raises doctrinal questions that have to be worked through in a church that takes doctrine seriously. The celibacy of the clergy is a legal problem within the church, a canonical problem. It could be changed tomorrow morning. And it is precisely because it's a canonical problem and not primarily or fundamentally, I think, a theological problem that accommodations are made in different ways. In the Eastern Rite, in the converts of people who come in from the Episcopal Church, we know we can work with this tactically and flexibly. And so it just seems to me you have a different kind of question on your hand when you're discussing the celibacy of the clergy. It doesn't mean it would change easily in an institution that doesn't change easily, but it's a fairly straightforward kind of question. It is about church law. It has values in it. I mean, I think quite apart from whether all the clergy would be celibate or not, the Catholic tradition believes that there's a certain kind of witness to the kingdom that comes from marriage, witness to the kingdom that comes from faithful single life, and another kind of witness to the kingdom that comes from celibate commitment as part of your institutional service in the church. I think that's a valuable kind of thing, but it doesn't have to be universalized, and the changing of it is fairly simple compared to some other questions. You will say to me, if it's simple, why don't we do it? Well,
if it's simple, why don't we do it? I'm a very quick study, Father.
I have always told undergraduates that to be Catholic is to be complicated. And because that is the case, even simple things take time. And my sense is the kind of feeling that exists on this question in this country is particularly strong. I'm not positive it's the same thing throughout the universal church, but it may be. I don't have the data. My own general sense is that to keep our eye on the fact that this is manageable, and it may be a question of tactics of working out pluralism with married and unmarried clergy in the same church. It doesn't seem to be an overwhelming problem if we could build consensus.
The other day, a church official mentioned to a friend of mine in the press that we couldn't have a married clergy because they would have to pay college tuition, and we could never afford that. It seems to me that this is an area where, in fact, to some extent, we are blocked by what we consider thinkable or what is unthinkable, and that there really is an opportunity for lay scholars or lay-formed commissions to look at the experiences of our fellow Christian groups that have married clergy and the groups within our own Catholic Church that have married clergy, both the positive things and the negative things, the problems, and think about a transition, conduct studies, put together volumes. It still would await some higher decision, but the more thinkable you could make something like that by dealing with the practical questions, even if it be paying for college tuition, I think the more it would move us in a positive direction.
Whenever I hear discussion of what is simple and what is complicated, I recall that noted philosopher Yogi Berra, who when asked whether he wanted his pizza cut in 6 or 8 slices, said, 6, I can't eat 8. But we're better than that. Sister, a personal question, and if you don't want to answer it, I understand, then talk about perhaps some of your colleagues. If you could, would you like to be a priest?
It's interesting. Several people ask that of sisters on a weekly basis, and I've done a study on that, and I'll tell you personally how I answer it and what the study reveals. I do not feel called to priesthood, and the vast majority of sisters who've entered religious orders since the Second Vatican Council do not feel called to priesthood either. So I feel, however, that in many of the orders, there's tremendous support for the question of the ordination of women, because so many people have seen the great sacramental need, and some of the orders which are international have sisters who've served in Latin America, and one of the things that some of the sisters say when they come home is that in some parts of Latin America, if you are rich and you die, you'll get a funeral mass. If you're poor and you die, you'll get a prayer service. And that distribution of the sacraments across class lines goes against, I think, every egalitarian U.S. impulse that we've got. And so I think a concern for many, many sisters is, again, the sacramental life of the church. I think some days we're more concerned about it than some priests are. And that is a very perplexing phenomenon that we ponder often, because this really is part of the core of the faith and of the church. And when you look at any institution, you have to be able to discern what's at the core and what's at the periphery. Well, you can change something that's peripheral and still have the essence of the institution. When you start fooling around with the core, you've got a different institution. And so what's driving, I think, many of us is that we're very concerned about the core of the Catholic Church.
Do you see anyone at the highest levels of the Church of the United States who understands this dilemma?
I think, as Father Hare suggested too, that many individual bishops confront this on a daily basis. And I have talked to some of them, and those men are under such pressure. I think they have one of the worst jobs in the whole country, really, in terms of the kind of daily pressure that's put on them from above and then from below. And I think that many are very upset about the specter of what confronts them, and that is that many of the finest men who serve the church, who were shaped by the Second Vatican Council, are in their 60s now, and there aren't a lot of young priests coming behind them. And the question is, what will happen to the sacraments, and what will happen to the parishes, what will happen to the structures that a lot of the immigrants built? And one of the things we've seen in the crisis is there's a real tapping into people's parents and grandparents and the work that it took to create these local structures, and people don't want to see them closing right and left. So.
Liz, if women could be ordained in the Catholic Church, amongst your peers, your friends, are you aware of some who would want to pursue?
Yes, actually, not as many as young men that I'm friends with who are interested, but I think there are a vast number of young women who feel that they're not necessarily called to be a sister, but that they feel called to be a priest. And it's frustrating for them because there's no place that they can fit, you know. And I have some older friends who are really struggling right now. Do I enter an order and become a sister, or do I just give up completely on the idea of an ordained life? And it's going against God's calling in a sense. So how do you rectify that problem?
How about being married and also being a priest?
See, that never comes up in conversations, because I think women are so focused on just trying to become the priest in the first place that they're not as concerned about the marriage aspect too. I mean, men are concerned about the marriage because they already are the priest. So, no, in conversations that I've had, that's not come up.
Patrick, we're picking up on your conversation about homosexuals and the interaction with the church. Several young Catholics said to me that it was impossible to get the Vatican to respond to the issue of sexual abuse, but when it came to gay marriage, there was a response within 24 hours. What are your friends, your colleagues, saying about that particular issue? About sexual abuse and the role of the Catholic leadership in enabling that? The response of the Vatican, as opposed to the response of the Church towards homosexuality and gay marriage?
I think it's very scary. On both ends. One, that ideas of clergy sexual abuse would be delayed, and then second, that people would be so quick to discount people because of sexual orientation. I feel as though that I myself feel as though the church is making decisions and is coming out in such cases when I don't know if they're going to the people that would be here tonight and asking them. I think that's very scary, that decisions are just coming down and that there's no discussion being held. I was directly affected by the church abuse scandal. I've known priests, well, not myself, but I've known priests who have been involved, and it hurt that such a case was delayed. And then like I've said, I know many homosexual Catholics who, when they hear a decision like that come down, they say, well, wait a minute, where did my identity go as a person, as a human being, and as a follower of Christ? So I think that's a scary point that you make, that such a thing happens.
At the same time, as we hear you saying these words, you are here tonight as a professed Catholic. Why do you think you are still able to come forward and talk with your attitude as strongly as you did and still feel very much part of this church?
I think that through my experiences, such as the Kairos program, which is a retreat that we have here at BC and other Jesuit high schools and colleges, the idea of that retreat is that, and the Jesuits, is that God is in all things, and that God is love. And every time I have an interaction with someone, and I see someone smile or I see someone cry, that I honest to God see God in that action. And no matter what the structure of the church, the problems with it, or the politics of it, I can't deny those chills that I get when I see the face of Christ every day in every person that I see, in the eyes that I see. And for me, if I were to deny that it would just, because it's such a large part of who I am, I could never let something like this interfere. I was actually confirmed freshman year, 2 years ago, when all this broke, and people always ask me, why would you get confirmed at a time like this? And I said, my love for people has not changed, and therefore my love for God has not changed. And if I were to have backed out of that, I would have denied myself the humanity that God is trying to give all of us.
Father, pick up on this if you would. We sit tonight in a diocese that has been terribly scarred by the sexual abuse. Church attendance and donations and so forth down considerably. Reach out to those Catholics who have stepped back, who now have lost faith in their hierarchy, lost faith in their church, perhaps lost their faith. What do you say to them about becoming re-energized, re-engaged with their church?